The afternoon of August 13th, 1944, near the French town of Argentan, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Werner sat motionless in the commander's cupola of his Panther tank, concealed beneath the dense foliage of an apple orchard. The tree cover was good, thick enough that from above the Panther's angular silhouette would blend into the mottled shadows. His crew had learned this lesson the hard way over the past 2 months. Movement during daylight meant death. Werner was 23 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had destroyed 9 Soviet tanks at Kursk. He understood armor combat, the geometry of angles and penetration, the calculus of who saw whom first. But what he heard now, building in the distance like summer thunder, represented something his training had never prepared him for. The deep, throaty rumble of radial engines, many of them, growing louder. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His radio crackled. It was his company commander, speaking in the clipped, controlled voice of a man forcing calm over panic. All units, Jabos approaching from the west. Engines off. Do not move. Do not fire. Wait for them to pass. Werner glanced at his driver, Gefreiter Hans Müller, who sat frozen at the controls, his hand already on the ignition cutoff. They had performed this drill a dozen times in the past week. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. The sound grew closer, a wall of mechanical noise that seemed to press down on the orchard like physical weight. Through the gaps in the leaves, Werner caught flashes of movement against the sky, dark cruciform shapes, lower than he expected, perhaps 200 meters altitude. He counted 8, then 12. Then, I stopped counting. The formation passed directly overhead, the noise now overwhelming, the distinctive beat of 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney engines, shaking unripe apples from the branches above. And then the sound changed. The steady drone fractured into individual notes as the aircraft broke formation. Werner's stomach tightened. They were circling back. Someone in the squadron had seen something. Perhaps the glint of metal, perhaps a track in the dirt leading into the orchard, perhaps nothing at all, just the systematic search pattern that Allied pilots had perfected over Normandy. The first P-47 Thunderbolt appeared above the tree line at an angle that seemed impossible, diving nearly vertical. Its nose pointed directly at the road junction 200 meters to Werner's left. He watched, transfixed, as the fighter grew larger with terrifying speed. At what seemed like the last possible moment, the aircraft's wings erupted in flickering light. All 8 machine guns firing simultaneously, 64 rounds per second, sound like industrial machinery tearing fabric. The road junction disappeared in a cloud of pulverized stone and dirt. A German supply truck that had been attempting to cross burst into flames, its cargo of ammunition beginning to cook off in staccato pops. The P-47 pulled up sharply, the scream of its engine mixing with the crack of small explosions, and Werner saw another fighter already rolling into its attack dive. This was not tank warfare, as Werner understood it. This was something else entirely. The certainty that had defined armoured combat on the Eastern Front, the knowledge that superior equipment and training could determine survival, meant nothing here. A Panther tank carried armour-proof against any Allied tank gun at combat ranges. Its long 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman at 1,500 meters. But none of this mattered when the threat came from above, delivered by an aircraft Werner could neither fight nor flee. The second P-47 dove on a different target, somewhere deeper in the orchard. Werner heard the distinctive hammering of 50 caliber fire, closer, now, and then an explosion that made his tank rock slightly on its suspension. One of his company's vehicles had been hit. He did not know which one. The radio remained silent. Speaking meant revealing position. Moving meant death. For the next 17 minutes, Werner sat in his cupola and watched as Republic P-47 Thunderbolts systematically dismantled his company's position. They came in pairs, one high to spot, one low to strike. They methodically worked over every vehicle, every position that might conceal armor or troops. The orchard, which had seemed like a sanctuary that morning, became a killing ground from which there was no escape. When the last fighter finally departed, trailing a thin stream of coolant from damage sustained by ground fire, Werner surveyed what remained. Of his company's 14 Panthers, 5 were burning, 3 more were damaged, their track or suspension destroyed by bombs or rockets. The supply column that had been attempting to reach them was scattered wreckage, and his company, which that morning had been a capable fighting force, was combat ineffective without having fired a single shot at an enemy tank. What Karl-Heinz Werner experienced that afternoon was not unique. Across the collapsing Normandy front, in the narrow confines of what would become known as the Falaise Pocket, the same scene repeated itself hundreds of times each day. German armour, which had dominated European battlefields for 4 years through technical superiority and tactical excellence, found itself paralysed by an enemy it could not engage. The P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft originally designed for high-altitude bomber escort, had become the instrument of a fundamental shift in armoured warfare. But this transformation did not happen through revolutionary technology or brilliant planning. It emerged from desperation, adaptation, and the unique conditions of the Normandy campaign. The question that haunted German tank commanders throughout the summer of Parta, 1944, was not whether they could destroy Allied armour in direct combat. They knew they could. The question was whether any of that superiority mattered when they could not move, could not manoeuvre, could not even survive the approach to battle without being torn apart from above. To understand how the P-47 came to terrorize German armoured forces requires understanding what the aircraft was, how it came to be employed in ground attack, and most critically, why its psychological impact far exceeded its actual lethality against heavy armour. The story begins not in the skies over France, but in a New York design office in late 1939, where a Georgian immigrant named Alexander Kartveli was sketching what would become the heaviest single-engine fighter of the Second World War. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was never intended to be a tank killer. When Kartveli first conceived the aircraft, he designed it as a pure fighter optimized for high-altitude combat. The United States Army Air Corps had observed the air war over Europe with growing concern. German fighters were faster, more heavily armed, and often better protected than American designs. British intelligence reports from the Battle of Britain painted a stark picture. Future air combat would occur at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, would require heavy armament to destroy robust enemy aircraft, and would demand armour protection for pilots facing concentrated defensive fire. Kartveli's response was characteristically direct. Build everything bigger, make it stronger, add more guns. The result was an aircraft that defied every principle of fighter design that had prevailed throughout the 1930s. Where conventional wisdom demanded lightweight and agility, Kartveli chose mass and power. Where tradition suggested 6 machine guns were adequate, he installed 8. Where other designers worried about complexity, he embraced it in service of performance. The P-47 that emerged from Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York, in May 1941, was genuinely extraordinary. Empty, it weighed 9,900 pounds, making it 65% heavier than the P-43 Lancer it was meant to replace. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and external stores, a P-47D could exceed 17,000 pounds, approaching the weight of twin-engine bombers like the Bristol Blenheim. Test pilots who first flew the prototype remarked that it handled more like a bomber than a fighter, requiring substantial runway for takeoff and demonstrating ponderous control responses compared to lighter contemporary designs. But this mass served a purpose. At the heart of the Thunderbolt sat the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower. This was the same power plant that would drive the Navy's F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, engines renowned for reliability and power. To harness this power at high altitude, where air density dropped to a fraction of sea level values, Kartveli designed an elaborate turbocharger system. Exhaust gases from the engine drove a turbine that compressed incoming air before feeding it to the cylinders, allowing the R2800 to maintain full power at altitudes where normally aspirated engines gasped for oxygen. The turbocharger installation required careful engineering. The turbine sat in the rear fuselage, connected to the engine by ducting that snaked through the airframe. The compressed air had to be cooled before entering the engine, requiring intercoolers mounted in the wing roots. The entire system added weight and complexity, but it gave the P-47 performance that astonished even experienced pilots. At 40,000 feet, where many fighters struggled to maintain level flight, the Thunderbolt could still accelerate and climb. Armament reflected the American philosophy of overwhelming firepower. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine. Guns, 4 mounted in each wing panel outboard of the propeller arc, gave the P-47 a combined rate of fire exceeding 100 rounds per second. The guns were staggered in the wing to allow side-by-side ammunition boxes, each holding 350 rounds. This provided approximately 30 seconds of continuous fire, substantially longer than most contemporary fighters. The installation was robust, the guns mounted firmly to minimize vibration and maintain accuracy. The psychological effect of all 8 guns firing simultaneously was devastating. Pilots who survived encounters with P-47 seconds consistently reported the impression of flying into a wall of tracers. The volume of fire was such that even if individual rounds missed, the cumulative effect created a lethal cone through which enemy aircraft could not pass unscathed. Ground targets experienced similar effects. 30 seconds of continuous fire meant 2,800 rounds, impacting a target area, sufficient to destroy soft vehicles, suppress defensive positions, and terrorize personnel caught in the open. Protection matched firepower. The pilot sat in a cockpit, surrounded by armor plate and bulletproof glass. A steel plate behind the seat protected against rear attacks. The windscreen incorporated thick laminated glass, capable of stopping rifle-caliber rounds. Critical systems were either armored or positioned to minimize vulnerability. The fuel tanks incorporated self-sealing technology, rubber layers that would swell when punctured by bullets, closing the hole and preventing fuel loss. Most importantly, the R2800 radial engine proved remarkably tolerant of battle damage. Unlike liquid-cooled inline engines like the Allison V1000, 710 or Rolls-Royce Merlin, which would seize within minutes if coolant lines were severed, the air-cooled radial could lose multiple cylinders and continue functioning. Pilots reported returning to base with 1 or more cylinders shot completely away, the engine running rough but still producing sufficient power for controlled flight. This survivability would prove critical when the P-47 transitioned to low-altitude ground attack work, where concentrated defensive fire was inevitable. When the Thunderbolt entered combat over Europe in April 1943, it performed its designed role admirably. The 8th Air Force, conducting daylight strategic bombing missions deep into German-occupied territory, desperately needed escort fighters capable of protecting bomber formations from Luftwaffe interceptors. The P-47's combination of high-altitude performance, heavy armament, and rugged construction made it well-suited to this mission. Fighter groups equipped with Thunderbolts began flying escort missions to targets in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The aircraft's combat debut revealed both strengths and limitations. At altitude, the P-47 could match or exceed the performance of most German fighters. Its dive performance was exceptional, allowing pilots to build tremendous speed in vertical descents that German aircraft could not follow. The heavy armament meant that even brief firing opportunities could be lethal, and the armor protection gave pilots confidence that they could survive encounters that would kill pilots in more fragile aircraft. But range remained a persistent problem. The internal fuel capacity, though substantial by the standards of 1943, limited escort missions to targets within 300 miles of English bases. Bomber formations attacking targets deeper in Germany flew unescorted through the most dangerous portions of their missions. The arrival of drop tanks, external fuel containers that could be jettisoned when empty, extended range somewhat, but the Thunderbolt could still not accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. This limitation became acute in late 1943 with the arrival of the North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang, powered by the Packard-built Merlin engine, demonstrated range capabilities that exceeded the P-47 by several hundred miles. Its liquid-cooled engine, though more vulnerable to damage, provided better specific fuel consumption, allowing the lighter airframe to travel farther on a given fuel load. By early 1944, 8th Air Force began transitioning its fighter groups from P-47 seconds to P-51 seconds for long-range escort missions. This created an operational dilemma for the 9th Air Force, the tactical air force being assembled to support the invasion of Normandy. The 9th Air Force had accumulated substantial numbers of P-47 seconds and experienced pilots trained to fly them. The aircraft was too capable to retire, too valuable to waste, but increasingly redundant in its designed role. Fighter groups equipped with Thunderbolts needed a mission, and the approaching demands of Operation Overlord suggested one. The concept of using fighters for ground attack was not new. The Luftwaffe had employed Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds in the Jabo role, carrying single bombs for hit-and-run attacks against ground targets. The Royal Air Force had developed the Hawker Typhoon specifically for ground attack after the aircraft proved disappointing as an interceptor. What was new was the scale of the American commitment and the systematic doctrine being developed for close air support. Major Glenn Duncan of the 353rd Fighter Group became the primary advocate for employing the P-47 inches ground attack. Duncan was a Texan, aggressive and innovative, with natural flying ability that had made him one of the more successful fighter pilots in 8th Air Force. He recognized that the P-47's heavy construction, which made it less agile than lighter fighters at medium altitudes, provided advantages in the low-altitude environment of ground attack. The armor that protected against fighter attacks would also protect against light anti-aircraft fire. The powerful engine would allow rapid acceleration after attack runs, minimizing exposure to defensive fire. And the heavy wing loading, a disadvantage in turning combat, provided a stable platform for weapons delivery. In March 1944, Duncan convinced his commanders to authorize operational trials. He took a flight of 4 P-47 seconds down to low altitude and conducted systematic strafing runs against rail yards and road traffic in occupied France. The results exceeded expectations. The volume of fire from 850 caliber guns proved devastatingly effective against trucks, trains, and structures. The aircraft's speed and armor allowed it to survive defensive fire that would have destroyed lighter aircraft, and the psychological effect on German forces was immediate and profound. The trials expanded rapidly. By May 1944, entire fighter groups were training in ground attack techniques. Pilots learned to identify targets from low altitude, to coordinate attacks for maximum effect, and to employ bombs and rockets in addition to guns. The doctrine emphasized speed and surprise. Attacks would be conducted at high speed, often preceded by a dive from altitude to build velocity. Multiple passes were discouraged as they allowed defenders to concentrate fire. The goal was to strike hard, strike fast, and depart before effective defensive response could be organized. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the transformation was complete. The P-47 had been formally redesignated as a fighter bomber within 9th Air Force. Early production P-47Ds carried a single 500-pound bomb on a centerline rack beneath the fuselage. Mid-production variants could carry 2,000-pound bombs on underwing pylons. Late production P-47D-25 and subsequent models could carry up to 2,500 pounds of external ordnance, roughly half the bomb load of a B-17 Flying Fortress. Rocket armament provided additional capabilities. Initial experiments with the 3.5-inch M8 rocket proved disappointing. The B weapon was inaccurate and difficult to employ effectively. But the development of the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, the HVAR, provided a weapon with performance comparable to a 5-inch naval gun. Each rocket carried an explosive charge equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell. A P-47 could carry 10 HVARs, 5 under each wing, providing firepower that ground forces compared to an artillery battery. The combination of guns, bombs, and rockets gave the P-47 unprecedented flexibility in the ground attack role. Bombs were effective against structures, bridges, and concentrated vehicles. Rockets could be employed against point targets like tanks or pillboxes, and guns remained the primary weapon for attacking troops, light vehicles, and suppressing anti-aircraft positions. Pilots learned to employ these weapons in combination, using bombs to crater roads and block retreat, rockets to destroy heavy equipment, and guns to strafe anything that moved. But effectiveness in ground attack required more than weapons and tactics. It required a systematic approach to targeting and coordination with ground forces. This had been a persistent challenge in earlier campaigns. In North Africa and Italy, communication between aircraft and ground units had been sporadic and unreliable. Pilots often had difficulty identifying targets, particularly in the confused environment of fluid combat. Ground forces had no reliable means of calling for air support when needed or preventing friendly fire when aircraft attacked the wrong positions. The solution developed for Normandy involved a network of air support parties, embedded with ground units and equipped with VHF radios compatible with aircraft frequencies. Forward air controllers, officers trained in both ground combat and air operations, rode in tanks or armoured vehicles immediately behind the front lines. They maintained radio contact with flights of P-47 seconds operating in assigned sectors, directing them to targets as they appeared and providing bomb damage assessment after attacks. This system, refined through practice in the months before D-Day, would prove critical to the Normandy campaign. Ground forces could call for immediate air support against specific targets. Form Room, the call sign for the air controller with the 3rd Armoured Division, became famous for the precision with which he directed P-47 strikes against German positions. Pilots praised the system for eliminating much of the guesswork from ground attack, allowing them to focus on weapons delivery rather than target identification. The system was not perfect. Radio communications remained prone to interference and equipment failure. The chaos of ground combat sometimes made it impossible for controllers to maintain accurate situation awareness. Friendly fire incidents occurred with tragic regularity, as disoriented pilots mistook Allied vehicles for German targets or attacked positions that had changed hands during fluid combat. But compared to earlier campaigns, the level of coordination achieved in Normandy represented a substantial improvement. What no one fully anticipated was the psychological effect this capability would have on German forces. The Wehrmacht in 1944 was still a formidable military organization. German armor remained superior in most direct combat situations. Panther and Tiger tanks could destroy Shermans at ranges where American tanks could not effectively return fire. German tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive maneuver and concentrated firepower. German soldiers, though increasingly aware of material shortages and the deteriorating strategic situation, remained capable and motivated fighters. But the presence of overwhelming Allied air power, and specifically the constant threat of P-47 attack, fundamentally altered how German forces could operate. This became apparent within hours of the Normandy landings and grew more pronounced as the campaign progressed. On the morning of June 7, 1944, elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, attempted to move from their assembly areas south of Caen to counterattack the Allied beachhead. The division possessed over 100 tanks, including substantial numbers of Panther tanks with long 75mm guns capable of destroying any Allied tank in Normandy. The division's soldiers, though young and inexperienced by Eastern Front standards, were well trained and fanatically motivated. Their orders were explicit: drive north, split the British and Canadian forces, and reach the coast by nightfall. The division never reached its objective. As columns of tanks and half-tracks began moving north in daylight, they were spotted by Allied reconnaissance aircraft. Within minutes, flights of P-47 seconds from the 366th Fighter Group arrived overhead. The attacks began immediately. Fighters dove from altitude, releasing bombs that cratered roads and destroyed lead vehicles, blocking the columns. Subsequent passes employed rockets and guns against vehicles trapped on the narrow Norman roads. The attacks continued throughout the morning, wave after wave of aircraft striking at anything that moved. By noon, the advance had stalled. The division had lost dozens of vehicles, not all of them armoured. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and command vehicles proved particularly vulnerable. Tanks that survived the attacks found themselves without fuel, without ammunition, or without orders, as the divisional communications network collapsed under the assault. The counterattack, which should have reached the coast by evening, had advanced only a few kilometers and was effectively paralyzed. General Fritz Witt, commanding the division, reported the situation to headquarters with unusual bluntness. Movement during daylight was impossible. The division could not concentrate its forces. Every attempt to maneuver invited immediate and overwhelming air attack. He requested permission to halt the advance, conceal his forces, and resume the attack at night. Permission was reluctantly granted. The counterattack, when it finally came under cover of darkness, had lost all momentum and achieved nothing. This pattern repeated itself across the Normandy front. German armoured divisions, attempting to manoeuvre to threaten sectors or conduct local counterattacks, found themselves pinned down by Allied air power. The standard German response to Allied offensives, the aggressive armoured counterattack designed to disrupt enemy plans and regain initiative, became impossible to execute in daylight. This represented a fundamental challenge to German tactical doctrine. Panzer divisions were designed for mobile warfare. Their effectiveness depended on rapid movement, concentration at critical points, and aggressive action. But these capabilities required daylight operations. Night movement, though it avoided air attack, sacrificed speed and coordination. Units became separated. Commanders lost situational awareness. The confusion of night operations multiplied tactical problems and prevented the kind of coordinated armoured thrusts that had characterized German success in earlier campaigns. The cumulative effect was paralysis. German armour remained formidable in defensive positions or in prepared ambushes where it could engage Allied tanks on favourable terms. But it could not manoeuvre, could not concentrate, could not perform the offensive operations for which it had been designed. And every day that German armour remained static was a day that Allied forces expanded their beachhead, brought more supplies ashore, and prepared for the breakout that would shatter the Normandy front. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. For German tank crews, the experience was profoundly demoralizing. These were men who had, in many cases, fought successfully on the Pommern, Eastern Front. They understood armoured warfare. They trusted their equipment and their training, but against the Jabos, none of that mattered. Karl-Heinz Werner, sitting in his Panther in the apple orchard near Argentan, possessed a tank capable of destroying any Allied armour at extended range. His crew was experienced and competent, but when the P-47 seconds appeared overhead, all of that capability became irrelevant. He could not fight back. He could not manoeuvre. He could only hide and hope the aircraft did not find him. The psychological effect extended beyond individual crews to entire formations. German commanders planning operations had to account for the certainty of air attack. Movements had to be scheduled for darkness or bad weather. Routes had to avoid open terrain where aircraft could easily spot vehicles. Assembly areas required overhead cover, limiting options and telegraphing intentions to Allied intelligence. The simple act of moving from one position to another, routine in earlier campaigns, became a complex operation fraught with risk. Lieutenant Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding a Panzer regiment in the 21st Panzer Division, described the frustration in his post-war memoir. His regiment possessed capable tanks and experienced crews, but throughout the Normandy campaign, he found himself unable to employ them effectively. Daylight movement invited immediate attack. Night operations sacrificed the coordination and speed that made armour effective. The regiment spent much of the campaign concealed in villages and forests, moving only when weather-grounded, Allied aircraft or darkness provided cover. Von Luck noted bitterly that his men felt like hunted animals rather than soldiers. The crews developed superstitions and rituals to cope with the stress. Some refused to move unless the weather was overcast. Others insisted on elaborate camouflage measures that consumed hours of time and provided minimal actual protection. A few, recognizing the futility of hiding from aircraft that could spot individual vehicles from thousands of feet altitude, adopted a fatalistic attitude that worried their officers. The constant strain of knowing that death could arrive from above at any moment, without warning and without possibility of effective response, wore on even experienced crews. But the most significant effect was operational. By mid-July 1944, German armoured forces in Normandy had effectively ceded daylight operations to the Allies. This represented an extraordinary reversal. The Wehrmacht, which had pioneered mobile armoured warfare and dominated European battlefields through aggressive manoeuvre, now operated primarily at night or in weather that grounded aircraft. The implications for German defensive strategy were profound. Allied commanders recognized the advantage and exploited it ruthlessly. When planning offensives, they scheduled operations to maximize the availability of air support. Attacks began after dawn, allowing maximum daylight hours for aircraft to support ground operations. Weather forecasts became critical elements of operational planning. Clear weather meant overwhelming air support. Overcast conditions required more cautious tactics and heavier reliance on artillery. The coordination between air and ground forces reached levels unprecedented in military history. Air controllers, embedded with forward units, could call down strikes within minutes of identifying targets. P-47 squadrons operated in cab-rank formations, orbiting over assigned sectors, waiting for targets to appear. When called, they could be attacking within 2 to 3 minutes. This responsiveness meant that German forces attempting to maneuver or counterattack faced immediate airstrikes before they could complete their movements. The system's effectiveness was demonstrated during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead in late July 1944. The operation began with a massive aerial bombardment involving over 1,500 heavy bombers. This was followed by coordinated attacks by medium bombers and fighter bombers against German positions along the Saint-Lô-Perriers road. When American ground forces began their advance, they did so under a continuous umbrella of air support. P-47 squadrons from the 405th Fighter Group played a critical role in the breakout. On July 29th, the group attacked a German armoured column trapped between Rancy and Saint-Denis-le-Veytu by elements of the American 2nd and 3rd Armoured Divisions. The attack began at 3:10 inches the afternoon and continued until 9:40 that evening, nearly 7 hours of continuous strikes. Pilots made repeated passes against the column, employing bombs, rockets, and guns against vehicles unable to escape the narrow roads. Post-battle investigation found 66 tanks, 204 other vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces destroyed in this single attack. The figures were compiled by ground troops who physically examined the wreckage, making them more reliable than pilot claims. The destroyed tanks included Panthers and Panzer IVs, vehicles that should have been effectively invulnerable to 50 caliber machine gun fire. But many had been destroyed by bombs or rockets, others had been disabled by damage to tracks, suspension, or running gear, then abandoned by crews who fled on foot. The Rancy engagement illustrated both the effectiveness and the limitations of air attack against armour. The P-47 seconds did destroy substantial numbers of tanks, but primarily through bombs and rockets rather than gunfire. Many more tanks were disabled rather than destroyed outright, victims of suspension damage or thrown tracks that immobilized the vehicles but left them potentially repairable. And the attack succeeded primarily because the German column was trapped by ground forces, unable to disperse or take cover in terrain that offered protection. But the raw numbers, while important, failed to capture the full effect. The German armoured units involved in the Rancy engagement ceased to exist as organised formations. Crews who survived abandoned their vehicles and attempted to escape on foot. Officers lost control of their commands as the communications network collapsed. The division to which these units belonged was effectively destroyed as a fighting force, not solely through physical destruction of equipment, but through the complete breakdown of cohesion and morale. This pattern would repeat itself on a larger and more dramatic scale in mid-August, during the Battle of the Falaise Pocket. The pocket formed when American forces advancing from the south and British and Canadian forces pushing from the north converged, threatening to encircle the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. Hitler's insistence on counterattacking rather than withdrawing delayed the German retreat until the trap was nearly closed. When German forces finally received permission to withdraw, they found themselves compressed into a shrinking pocket with only narrow corridors of escape. Allied air forces threw everything available into attacking the pocket. Typhoons from the Royal Air Force 2nd Tactical Air Force struck from the north, P-47 seconds from the 9th Air Force attacked from the south and west. The continuous attacks turned the roads through the pocket into corridors of destruction. Vehicles abandoned earlier blocked routes, forcing subsequent traffic to slow or stop. This created perfect targets for aircraft that could strike at will against columns unable to disperse or find cover. The weather favored the attackers. August 17th through 21st provided clear skies and excellent visibility. P-47 squadrons flew multiple sorties per day, some pilots completing 4 or 5 missions in a single day. The pace was exhausting but sustainable given the short distances between forward airfields and the target area. Ground crews worked through the night, rearming and refueling aircraft so they would be ready for the next day's operations. The scale of destruction was staggering. The pocket was littered with thousands of destroyed and abandoned vehicles. Tanks sat alongside horse-drawn wagons. Half-tracks burned next to civilian automobiles that German forces had commandeered. The roads were so choked with wreckage that advancing Allied forces had to bring up bulldozers to clear paths for their own vehicles. But post-battle investigation revealed a more complex picture than pilot claims suggested. The British No. 2 Operational Research Section conducted a detailed survey of destroyed armour in the pocket. They physically examined every destroyed tank and armoured vehicle they could locate, attempting to determine the cause of loss. The results were surprising. Of the identifiable tank kills, only a small fraction could be definitively attributed to air attack. Most tanks found in the pocket had been abandoned by their crews, either because they had run out of fuel, suffered mechanical failure, or been disabled by ground fire. The survey counted approximately 387 tanks and self-propelled guns examined in detail. Of these, the researchers could definitively attribute only 11 to destruction by aircraft. Many more bore evidence of air attack, pockmarks from machine gun fire, or near-miss damage from bombs and rockets. But the damage was not sufficient to have destroyed the vehicles. They had been abandoned by crews who either fled under air attack or simply lacked the fuel or spare parts to continue operating. This finding has been the subject of considerable historical debate. Some historians argue it demonstrates that air power's effectiveness against armour was overstated, that pilot claims were wildly optimistic, and that the P-47's reputation as a tank killer was largely unearned. Others contend that the survey missed the larger point. Whether aircraft physically destroyed tanks mattered less than whether they rendered armoured units combat ineffective. A tank abandoned because its fuel truck was destroyed by air attack was just as useless to German commanders as a tank destroyed directly by a bomb. The truth likely lies between these extremes. The P-47's 50-caliber machine guns could not reliably penetrate the armour of Panthers and Tigers from any angle. The roof armour on these vehicles, the thinnest and most vulnerable to aircraft attack, measured 26 millimeters. This was theoretically vulnerable to 50-caliber armour-piercing ammunition striking at 90 degrees, but achieving such hits in combat was extremely difficult. Aircraft typically attacked at angles that increased effective armour thickness. The guns converged at a specific range, and hitting a moving or stationary tank at that precise distance, while diving at high speed, required exceptional skill and luck. Bombs and rockets proved more effective but still far from decisive against heavy armour. A 500-pound general-purpose bomb had to strike within approximately 5 meters of a tank to guarantee destruction. Near misses might damage tracks or suspension, but leave the tank repairable. Rockets, while impressive in appearance and psychological effect, proved notoriously inaccurate. Pilots frequently reported that rockets would veer off course after launch, influenced by wind, turbulence, or minor variations in the rocket motor. Hitting a tank-sized target with rockets was more luck than skill. Yet the cumulative effect of the air attack was devastating to German armoured operations. Tanks required extensive logistical support to remain operational. A Panther consumed approximately 150 litres of fuel per 100 kilometres of travel, roughly 1.5 litres per kilometre. This was delivered in 5-litre jerrycans carried by trucks. A Panzer company required multiple trucks just to carry fuel for a single day's operations. These trucks, soft-skinned and highly vulnerable, were perfect targets for P-47 machine guns. Ammunition presented similar challenges. A Panther carried 79 rounds for its main gun, sufficient for perhaps 2 or 3 engagements. Resupply required half-tracks or trucks carrying additional ammunition forward to tank positions. Again, these vehicles were vulnerable to air attack in ways that the tanks themselves were not. A company that expended its ammunition in combat and then had its resupply convoy destroyed by air attack was combat ineffective, regardless of whether the tanks themselves were damaged. Maintenance posed yet another vulnerability. Panther tanks, despite their combat effectiveness, were mechanically complex and prone to breakdown. The final drive, which transmitted power from the transmission to the drive sprockets, was notoriously weak and required frequent replacement. Doing this in the field required spare parts, specialized tools, and time. If maintenance vehicles were destroyed by air attack, if spare parts could not reach forward units, if crews lacked the time to perform repairs because they had to remain hidden during daylight, tanks broke down and were abandoned. The P-47's effectiveness, then, lay not in destroying tanks directly, but in systematically dismantling the logistical and organizational infrastructure that allowed armored units to function. A Panzer division was not simply a collection of tanks. It was a complex organization of combat vehicles, supply trucks, maintenance facilities, command posts, and communications networks. Air attack could target every element of this system, destroying a fuel dump or a maintenance depot or a headquarters complex affected combat capability as surely as destroying tanks in the front line. German commanders understood this reality, even if historians would debate it for decades afterward. General Hans von Kluge, commanding Army Group West during the Normandy campaign, reported repeatedly to Berlin that Allied air superiority made armored operations impossible. He did not complain primarily about tanks being destroyed. He complained that his forces could not move, could not concentrate, could not perform the offensive maneuvers that German doctrine required. The tanks remained formidable, but they were paralyzed, rendered impotent by an enemy that struck from above and could not be effectively engaged. This understanding spread through the ranks. Tank crews learned that survival depended on avoiding detection. They became experts at camouflage, at identifying covered positions, at minimizing any activity that might draw attention from patrolling aircraft. They learned to recognize the sound of different Allied aircraft, to distinguish between the deep rumble of P-47 seconds and the higher-pitched whine of P-51 seconds, or the distinctive growl of British Typhoons. They learned that movement invited death, and that their best hope was to remain hidden and hope the aircraft passed overhead without spotting them. The psychological cost was profound. These were men who had been trained for aggressive mobile warfare, who understood armor doctrine that emphasized movement and shock action. But in Normandy, they found themselves reduced to passive defense, hiding from an enemy they could not fight. The frustration was compounded by the knowledge that their equipment was superior to Allied tanks. In direct combat, a Panther could destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before being knocked out, but such combats were becoming rare. More often, Panther crews sat concealed, waiting for weather or darkness, while Allied forces maneuvered with impunity under the protection of air cover. Werner's experience in the apple orchard near Argentan represented the culmination of this psychological transformation. He commanded a capable tank with an experienced crew. He understood tactics and had proven his competence in combat. But when the P-47 seconds appeared overhead, all of that expertise became irrelevant. He could only wait, hope his camouflage held, and watch as other vehicles in his company were destroyed one by one. The powerlessness was complete. The attacks themselves followed a pattern that German crews learned to recognize. The first indication would be the sound of engines, sometimes at such distance that the aircraft were not yet visible. Experienced crews could identify the type of aircraft by sound alone. The deep rumble of R-2800 radials meant P-47 seconds. The higher-pitched note of Merlins indicated P-51 seconds or Typhoons. The sound would grow steadily louder as the aircraft approached, and crews would prepare for what might come next. If the formation passed overhead without breaking up, there was hope. The aircraft might not have spotted anything, or might be en route to other targets. But if the engine noise changed, If the steady drone fractured into individual notes as aircraft broke formation and began circling, the attack was imminent. This was the moment of maximum terror. Crews knew they had been spotted but did not know where the attack would fall. Would their position be the target, or would the aircraft strike elsewhere? There was no way to know and nothing to do but wait. When the attack came, it arrived with shocking speed. Aircraft that had been circling at altitude would suddenly roll into near-vertical dives, plummeting toward the ground at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. The diving aircraft would seem to hang motionless for a moment, growing larger with impossible rapidity, and then the wings would light up with muzzle flashes as the pilot opened fire. The sound of 850 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously was unlike anything else in war. It was not the crack of individual shots, but a continuous tearing noise, like heavy canvas being ripped apart at tremendous speed. The volume of fire was such that individual bullets could not be distinguished. They arrived as a stream of tracers and unseen projectiles that chewed up earth, shattered wood, and sparked off metal. Anything caught in that stream died or was destroyed. German crews learned that the best hope of survival was complete immobility. Moving meant revealing position. Firing back meant giving the aircraft a point to target. Even starting the engine to attempt escape drew attention. The only defense was to remain absolutely still and hope that the aircraft was targeting something else. This passive defense went against every instinct and every element of training. Soldiers were taught to fight back, to take aggressive action. But against the Jabos, aggression meant death. The attacks typically came in waves. After the first aircraft pulled up from its dive, others would roll in from different directions. This prevented defenders from concentrating fire and kept vehicles under attack from multiple angles. Pilots learned to coordinate their runs, one aircraft attacking while another positioned for the next dive. The attacks would continue until all ordnance was expended or until defensive fire became too intense to continue safely. For the men on the ground, the attacks seemed to last forever. In reality, most P-47 attacks lasted only 2 to 3 minutes from first dive to final departure, but the psychological time dilation common in combat made minutes feel like hours. Crews emerged from attacks exhausted and shaking, even if their vehicle had not been hit. The stress of waiting helplessly while explosions walked closer, of hearing impacts against their tank's armor, of not knowing whether the next bomb or rocket would be the one that found them, accumulated into a particular species of trauma. After the aircraft departed, there would be a period of stunned silence. Crews would check themselves for wounds, verify that their vehicle was still functional, and then survey the damage around them. This was often when the full cost became apparent. Vehicles that had been intact minutes before now burned. Comrades who had been alive were dead. The orchard or forest or village that had seemed like sanctuary was now scarred with craters and littered with wreckage. The psychological aftermath was, in some ways, worse than the attack itself. Crews had to extract themselves from whatever cover they had found and resume operations, knowing that more attacks would come. There was no respite, no safety. During daylight hours, the Jabos could appear at any time. This constant threat, the knowledge that death could arrive without warning from above, induced a hypervigilance that exhausted men even when they were not under active attack. Sleep became difficult. Even at night, when aircraft rarely operated, crews remained tense. Every engine sound, every distant explosion, triggered the same adrenaline response as actual attack. Men would jerk awake at sounds that, in other circumstances, would have been meaningless. The cumulative sleep deprivation degraded performance, slowed reaction times, and contributed to a general deterioration in unit effectiveness. Morale effects rippled outward from frontline crews to entire divisions. Soldiers who had not personally experienced air attacks heard stories from those who had. The stories grew in the telling, as trauma narratives always do, creating a mythology around the Jabos that exceeded even their actual lethality. The aircraft became talismans of Allied power, symbols of an enemy so wealthy and technologically advanced that it could afford to expend overwhelming force against any target. This perception was reinforced by the sheer number of aircraft the Allies deployed. German soldiers, accustomed to Luftwaffe air support that rarely materialized in 1944, were stunned by the continuous presence of Allied aircraft over the battlefield. At any given moment during daylight hours, Allied fighters could be seen overhead. Sometimes they patrolled at high altitude, tiny specks against the sky. Other times they flew low, working over suspected positions, or simply demonstrating their presence. The contrast with German air power was stark and demoralizing. The Luftwaffe in mid-1944 was a shadow of its former strength. Years of attrition, fuel shortages, and the prioritization of home defense meant that few German fighters operated over France. Those that did appear were usually quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers of Allied aircraft. German soldiers learned not to expect air support and to regard any appearance by friendly aircraft as a remarkable and probably temporary occurrence. This air power disparity became a visible demonstration of the material imbalance between the two sides. Crews sitting in their Panthers knew their tanks were superior to Shermans, but they also knew that the Allies could put 10 Shermans in the field for every German tank. They knew that Allied artillery always seemed to have ammunition while German guns increasingly rationed shells. And they knew that the skies belonged entirely to the enemy, a daily reminder that Germany was losing the industrial war that ultimately determined victory or defeat. Officers struggled to maintain morale in the face of these realities. Traditional motivations, pride in equipment and unit cohesion, and belief in tactical superiority lost their force when men spent their days hiding from aircraft they could not fight. Discipline held, as German military discipline generally did through even desperate circumstances, but the quality of that discipline changed. Men followed orders not from belief in victory or even survival, but from simple habit and the knowledge that courts-martial waited for those who refused. Some units attempted to fight back against the aircraft. Anti-aircraft weapons, particularly the feared 88mm flak guns that had proven so effective in other roles, could bring down attacking aircraft if properly positioned. But flak guns were themselves priority targets for Allied fighter bombers. Firing at attacking aircraft revealed position and invited immediate counterattack. Many flak crews learned to remain silent until attacked, accepting casualties in the hope of preserving their weapons for future engagements. The lighter automatic weapons that accompanied armoured columns, 20mm and 37mm flak guns, proved largely ineffective against high-speed diving fighters. The guns could not traverse fast enough to track aircraft in their attack dives. By the time gunners had the aircraft in their sights, it had already released weapons and begun its pullout. Firing at departing aircraft wasted ammunition and revealed position without significantly affecting attack effectiveness. Some tank crews attempted to engage aircraft with their main guns or machine guns. This was generally futile and often counterproductive. Tank guns could not elevate sufficiently to engage diving aircraft. Machine gun fire was ineffective against armoured aircraft like the P-47 unless hits were achieved on critical areas like the engine or cockpit. And firing at aircraft drew attention, marking the tank's position for follow-up attacks. Most experienced commanders forbade their crews from shooting at aircraft, ordering them to save ammunition for ground targets and maintain camouflage discipline. The one partially effective countermeasure was weather. Overcast skies and low visibility grounded most Allied aircraft, providing windows during which German forces could move relatively safely. Commanders learned to watch weather forecasts closely and schedule operations for periods when conditions would limit air operations. The Norman weather, notoriously unpredictable, provided occasional opportunities. Morning fog, rain squalls, and low overcast could persist for hours or even days, allowing German forces to reposition or resupply under cover of clouds. But relying on weather meant surrendering initiative to meteorological chance. Operations planned for one day might have to be cancelled if skies cleared unexpectedly. Movements that should have taken hours stretched into days as units waited for favourable weather. And Allied commanders, understanding German dependency on poor weather, learned to exploit clear conditions ruthlessly. When weather cleared after a period of overcast, Allied aircraft would saturate the battlefield, striking at any German unit that had moved during the bad weather. By late August 1944, the cumulative effect of 2 months of continuous air attack had fundamentally altered German tactical capabilities in the West. Armoured divisions that had entered Normandy with strength and confidence were shadows of their former effectiveness. Some had been destroyed outright, their personnel killed or captured, and their equipment lost. Others remained nominally intact but had been degraded to the point where they could no longer perform their designed role. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket represented the culmination of this process. Approximately 100,000 German soldiers found themselves trapped in a steadily shrinking perimeter under constant attack from ground and air. The roads through the pocket became killing grounds. Vehicles attempting to escape ran a gauntlet of fighter-bomber attacks that turned the narrow lanes into corridors lined with burning wrecks. The psychological horror of the Falaise Pocket exceeded even earlier experiences. German soldiers found themselves in an environment where survival seemed impossible regardless of action taken. Staying in place meant being overrun by advancing Allied ground forces. Moving meant exposure to air attack. Surrendering meant captivity. But fighting to the last meant certain death. The trapped forces fragmented as unit cohesion collapsed under the pressure. Individual soldiers and small groups attempted to escape on foot, abandoning vehicles and heavy equipment. Those who survived the pocket carried memories that haunted them for decades. Post-war accounts consistently describe the same elements: the constant roar of aircraft engines, the systematic destruction of everything that moved, the smell of burning vehicles and flesh, the sight of roads so choked with wreckage that escape routes became impassable, and above all, the sense of powerlessness, of being hunted by an enemy against whom no defense was possible. Approximately 20 to 50,000 German soldiers managed to escape the pocket, most having abandoned their equipment. The 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, which had defended Normandy for 2 months, ceased to exist as organized formations. Of the armoured strength that had been committed to the defence, only a fraction remained. Most divisions had lost their tanks, either destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel or spare parts. Those vehicles that did escape were often in poor mechanical condition and lacked the logistical support needed to return them to operational status. The P-47's role in this destruction remained subject to interpretation. Pilot claims suggested they had destroyed thousands of tanks and vehicles. Ground investigation revealed a more modest count of confirmed kills, but focusing solely on destroyed equipment missed the broader operational effect. German armoured forces in Normandy had been rendered combat ineffective, not primarily through the physical destruction of tanks, but through the systematic disruption of every system that allowed armoured units to function. This represented a fundamental shift in the nature of armoured warfare. For the previous 5 years, the tank had been the dominant weapon on European battlefields. Armoured formations had decided campaigns in Poland, France, the Soviet Union, and North Africa. Tactical doctrine across all armies emphasized the decisive role of armour in mobile operations. But Normandy demonstrated that armour dominance was contingent on control of the air above the battlefield. A tank that could not move because its fuel trucks had been destroyed was useless. A tank that could not fight because its ammunition could not reach the front was irrelevant. A tank whose crew was too demoralized to operate effectively might as well not exist. The P-47, and Allied tactical air power more broadly, did not end tank warfare in any literal sense. Tanks remained critical weapons throughout the remainder of the war and beyond, but the relationship between air power and armoured forces had permanently shifted. German commanders recognized this reality even as the Normandy campaign collapsed around them. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, before his relief and subsequent suicide, reported to Berlin that continued operations were impossible without air superiority. He did not request more tanks or better armour or improved anti-tank weapons. He requested control of the skies, understanding that without it, German ground forces were operating under conditions that made success impossible regardless of other factors. The lessons were not lost on the Allies. The coordination between air and ground forces demonstrated in Normandy became standard doctrine for subsequent operations. Tactical air forces were fully integrated into ground operations, with air controllers embedded at every level from division down to individual armoured columns. The P-47 remained the primary ground attack aircraft through the end of the war in Europe, flying hundreds of thousands of sorties and claiming destruction of material that, even accounting for overclaiming, represented a significant proportion of German military capability. But the aircraft's effectiveness rested on factors beyond its weapons or performance. The P-47 succeeded because it operated within a system that provided targeting information, coordinated attacks, ensured adequate supply of fuel and ammunition, and most importantly, operated under conditions of complete air superiority. A lone P-47 attacking a well-defended position could be shot down as easily as any other aircraft. But formations of P-47 seconds, supported by reconnaissance aircraft, coordinated by ground controllers, and operating in skies cleared of enemy fighters, represented a capability against which German ground forces had no effective counter. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.